I never thought a conversation with my parents would feel like a verdict. The night started like any other: dinner at their house, the usual small talk, the clinking of forks against plates, the hum of the ceiling fan overhead. But as dessert was cleared away, my mother and father exchanged glances that felt heavier than usual. My mother's fingers trembled slightly as she folded her napkin, and my father's jaw tightened, his eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite place. I should have known then that this wasn't going to be a normal evening. "Sit down, please," my father said, voice low and firm. I obeyed, heart suddenly pounding with unease. They both looked at me with expressions I'd never seen before, serious, almost guilty, but resolute. It was like they were bracing themselves to drop a bomb I didn't know was coming. "We need to talk about something important," my mother began, her voice soft but deliberate. "It's about the will." For a moment, I thought I misheard. The will? What about it? I'd always assumed that, one day, I would inherit a piece of their estate, their treasures, the legacy they'd built over decades. But their faces told a different story. I felt my throat tighten, the air leaving my lungs without permission. "We've decided to make some changes," my father continued, avoiding my gaze but meeting my eyes with flickers of something I couldn't place: regret. Determination? "We've written you out of the will." The words hit me like a sudden, cold wave crashing over everything I thought was solid in my life. Written out? My voice was barely a whisper, disbelief making it hard to speak. "Why? What do you mean?" My mother's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her voice didn't waver. "It's not punishment. It's a lesson, something we hope will help you understand responsibility and respect." I blinked, trying to digest what they were saying. My parents, who had always been my pillars, my guides, were now telling me that I wasn't worthy of the inheritance they had carefully planned over the years. That I wasn't trusted with their legacy because of something I had done, or hadn't done. The room felt suddenly smaller, the walls closing in as the weight of their words settled. I wanted to ask so many questions, but my mouth refused to cooperate. How long had they been planning this? Why hadn't they talked to me about their concerns before making such a drastic decision? Was this really about teaching me something, or was it a punishment wrapped in a lesson? I felt anger stirring beneath the shock, but I swallowed it down, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can you explain what led to this?" "I didn't realize things were so bad," I managed, my hands clenched tightly in my lap. My father sighed deeply, the lines on his face deepening. "You've always been independent, but sometimes that independence felt like disrespect for the values we raised you with. You've made choices that hurt not just yourself but the family. We hoped that by removing this safety net, you'd see the importance of accountability." I felt a sudden rush of betrayal. Was this the way they saw me? As someone who was reckless, disrespectful, and undeserving? I thought about the phone calls I'd missed, the disagreements over life choices, the moments when I pushed back against their expectations. Maybe they had been building up to this for years, silently disappointed, hoping I'd change without having to say it outright. The idea that my parents had been silently disappointed, and now were forcing me into a corner with this lesson, felt suffocating. I'd always believed in unconditional love, that family was a constant even when we stumbled. But this felt conditional, contingent on meeting their standards, or else being cut off. "Is this permanent?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. "Or is this really about making me see something? Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like rejection." My mother reached out, placing a hand on mine. "It's not rejection. It's tough love. We want you to understand that life isn't about entitlement. You have to earn your place, just like anyone else." But the words didn't comfort me. Instead, they echoed in my mind like a cold echo chamber. I looked at them, two people I loved, two people who had nurtured me, and felt a chasm opening wide between us. How did we get here? When had love become a ledger of debts and credits? I thought back to every family dinner where we argued over trivial things, every birthday party where I felt like a guest rather than a child, every moment I pushed against their rules trying to carve my own path. Had those moments added up to this? Was this their way of saying I didn't measure up? I swallowed hard, trying to keep the sting of tears at bay. I need time to process this, I said quietly, standing up. The room felt too small, the air too thick. I needed space, physical and emotional. As I walked to the door, my father's voice stopped me. We're not trying to hurt you. We want you to grow. Sometimes love is hard. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I understood. Love felt like an unsteady tightrope now, one I wasn't sure I could walk without falling. I left their house that night carrying a weight I hadn't expected, a mixture of confusion, hurt, and a flicker of something else, a strange kind of resolve. If this was a lesson, if this was their way of forcing me to see myself differently, then I needed to understand what I was missing. But I also knew that understanding wouldn't come easily. It would take time, reflection, and maybe a confrontation with parts of myself I'd long avoided. Driving away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw their house shrinking behind me, the porch light still glowing softly in the darkness. It was the same house I'd grown up in, but it felt different now. Not just a home, but a battleground for love, expectations, and painful truths. The silence in the car was loud, filled with questions I wasn't ready to answer. What had I done wrong? What did they expect me to learn? And most painfully, what did this mean for us, for our family? I didn't have the answers yet. But I knew one thing for certain, nothing would be the same again. The days after that conversation were a blur of restless nights and tangled thoughts. I found myself replaying every interaction, every moment that might have led us here. What had I done to deserve being written out of the will? It wasn't just the loss of money or property, it felt like a deeper fracture, a wound that cut through the very fabric of our family. I started piecing together the past few years like a puzzle, searching for the moment when things had gone wrong. It wasn't easy. Our family had never been perfect, but I thought we understood each other, even when we disagreed. Yet now, I saw those disagreements in a new light, as cracks widening beneath the surface. There was the time I refused to take over the family business, choosing instead to pursue a career that felt meaningful to me. My parents had been supportive, at least on the surface, but beneath that support was a simmering disappointment I hadn't acknowledged before. They wanted me to carry on their legacy, but I wanted a different path. I thought they accepted that, but maybe they saw it as rebellion or disrespect. Then there were the arguments about money, my decisions to spend on experiences rather than savings, my refusal to live by the strict budget they'd advised me to follow. I'd always thought they were just worried about my future, but maybe they took it as a lack of responsibility. I remembered the sharp words, the sighs of frustration when I ignored their advice, and the silence that followed. I also thought about family gatherings, where I often felt like an outsider despite being their child. Their conversations sometimes felt like lectures, their eyes searching for signs that I was failing to live up to their expectations. I pushed back with sarcasm or silence, not knowing how else to react. Even my relationship with my siblings had been strained. Jealousy, misunderstandings, and competition had layered over years, creating distance I hadn't tried hard enough to bridge. I'd assumed things would smooth out with time, but maybe the undercurrents had been too strong. The more I reflected, the clearer it became that this wasn't a sudden decision but the result of years of tension, disappointment, and unmet expectations. My parents' choice to rewrite the will was their way of expressing something deeper, frustration, hurt, and maybe a desperate hope to wake me up. But understanding this didn't make it easier to bear. I felt caught between wanting to defend myself and needing to see their perspective. I realized I had been blind to how much my actions, or inactions, had affected them. I saw now how my independence might have felt like defiance, my choices like disregard. At the same time, I wrestled with the feeling that their expectations were suffocating, that their vision of who I should be didn't leave room for who I was becoming. It was a painful realization that love, when wrapped tightly in conditional approval, could feel like a cage. I tried to talk to my siblings, hoping to find support or at least understanding. But our conversations were awkward, filled with half-truths and unspoken resentments. They didn't know how to navigate this new terrain either. The family I thought I knew seemed fragmented and fragile. I also reached out to a few close friends, seeking perspective. They listened, offering comfort and advice, but none could truly grasp the complexity of being cut out of your own family's plans. One friend told me, sometimes parents try to teach lessons the only way they know how, even if it hurts. Another said, maybe this is their way of pushing you to grow, but it doesn't mean they don't love you. Their words lingered in my mind, but the silence from my parents was deafening. I longed for a conversation, not just about the will, but about us. I wanted to understand their fears and hopes, to share my own, to find a way back from this chasm. At the same time, I felt a simmering anger beneath my sorrow. How could they believe that cutting me out would make me better? Hadn't love been about support, even when mistakes were made? Was this lesson really about respect, or was it about control? I remembered the moments when I'd reached out for help or understanding, only to be met with coldness or dismissal. I thought about the times I'd tried to explain my choices, only to be told I was wrong or selfish. Those memories stung sharper now, casting shadows over the love I had once felt so sure of. And yet, despite the hurt, a small part of me wanted to believe that this was not the end. That beneath the disappointment and anger, my parents still cared deeply, even if they struggled to show it in healthy ways. That maybe, through this painful lesson, there could be growth, for all of us. I thought about the family dinners I used to cherish, the laughter and stories shared around the table. I wondered if we could find our way back to that place, or if the damage was too deep. The hope felt fragile, but it was all I had. Late one evening, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone, snapshots of birthdays, holidays, and vacations. Faces smiling, arms wrapped around each other, moments frozen in time. I traced the lines of my parents' faces, the twinkle in their eyes, the way they looked at me in those happier times. It was a reminder that beneath the pain, there was history, years of love, mistakes, forgiveness, and growth. Our story wasn't over, but it needed a new chapter. I knew this journey wouldn't be easy. It would require confronting uncomfortable truths, having difficult conversations, and maybe forgiving wounds that ran deep. But I was ready to try because I didn't want to lose the family I loved. In the quiet moments, I began to write down my thoughts, letters to my parents I wasn't yet ready to send, reflections on my own behavior, hopes for what could come next. It was a way to process the turmoil and find some clarity. I realized that understanding the family tensions was the first step, not to assign blame, but to see the full picture. To recognize that we were all flawed, all struggling, all trying to hold on to love in our own imperfect ways. The days passed, each one bringing a mix of pain and insight. I learned that family dynamics are rarely simple, that respect and misunderstanding can coexist, and that sometimes the hardest lessons come wrapped in the most painful packages. But most of all, I understood that this moment, the moment of being written out of the will, was not just an ending. It was an invitation to look deeper, to listen harder, and to find a path toward healing that none of us had yet dared to walk. And with that fragile hope, I prepared myself for whatever came next. The nights were the hardest. When the house grew quiet and the world outside dimmed, my mind refused to rest. The words my parents had spoken, their decision, their reasoning, echoed relentlessly, weaving through every thought like a persistent shadow. I felt untethered, caught between confusion and hurt, anger and longing, unsure of where I belonged in this fractured family narrative. I kept turning over the question, how did we get here? What had I done to earn this exclusion, this profound reshaping of my place in their lives? The idea of being written out of the will was not just about inheritance, it was a symbolic erasure, a line drawn between who I was and who I was supposed to be. It felt like a final judgment, but I couldn't quite grasp the full meaning behind it. I started to revisit my memories, not just the big, obvious moments, but the small, everyday interactions that might have sown seeds of misunderstanding. I thought about the times I had been distant, distracted, or dismissive. The times I had pushed back against their expectations, not out of rebellion but out of a desire to find my own way. I wondered if they saw my independence as defiance, my choices as betrayal. There was the time I declined their invitation to the family reunion, citing work commitments. At the time, I thought it was a reasonable excuse, but now I wondered if it had been perceived as rejection. The heated phone call that followed still stung in my memory, the sharp words, the accusation that I didn't care enough. I had tried to explain, but the conversation ended with silence. I reflected on the financial debates, the arguments about saving versus spending, about responsibility and freedom. I had always believed in carving my own path, but maybe they saw my choices as reckless or selfish. Had I been disregarding their advice because I thought I knew better? Probably. But I had never meant to hurt them. And then there were the moments I had been too proud, too stubborn to ask for help or admit mistakes. I remembered my mother's eyes during one particularly difficult period, when I was struggling but refused to say so. She had reached out, but I'd pulled away, unwilling to show vulnerability. Maybe, in their eyes, that was another form of disrespect, refusing to accept their support. As I sifted through these memories, I felt the sharp edge of regret. I realized that my actions, or in some cases, inactions, had contributed to the growing divide. But I also felt a surge of frustration. If love is supposed to be unconditional, why were these mistakes enough to erase me from their plans? Why had no one spoken up before it came to this? I found myself questioning not just my relationship with my parents but also my understanding of love and family. Was it possible that love could be both fierce and conditional? That respect demanded more than just affection, that it required conformity to certain expectations? The emotional turmoil was exhausting. I felt like I was walking through a storm with no shelter, caught in the rain of doubt and the wind of pain. My confidence wavered, my sense of self shaken. I wondered if I was truly the person they thought I was, a disappointment, a rebel, someone who didn't deserve their trust. Yet beneath the hurt, a small voice whispered that I was more than their judgment. That I was worthy of love and respect, even if I didn't fit their mold perfectly. That maybe this painful moment was a call to grow, not just for them, but for me. I struggled to reconcile these conflicting feelings. I wanted to reach out and fix the broken pieces, but I didn't know where to start. I feared rejection, yet feared silence even more. I wanted to be heard, understood, but also feared that my words would fall on deaf ears. One afternoon, I sat by the window with a notebook, trying to put my swirling emotions into words. Writing became a refuge, a way to untangle the knots inside me. I wrote about my fears, my regrets, my hopes. I wrote letters to my parents I wasn't ready to send, asking questions, begging for understanding. In those pages, I confronted the pain head-on. I admitted how much I had hurt, how much I had felt unseen. I acknowledged my mistakes without excuses. I also expressed my desire to rebuild, to heal, to find a way back to the family I loved. But I also wrote about boundaries, about needing respect for the person I was becoming. About wanting a relationship where love wasn't contingent on perfection or compliance. I realized that forgiveness would have to be a two-way street. The process was both painful and liberating. It forced me to face uncomfortable truths, to accept responsibility, but also to stand up for myself. I began to see that healing wouldn't come from denying the hurt but from embracing it fully. I reached out to a therapist, hoping for guidance through this emotional labyrinth. In those sessions, I learned to listen to my feelings without judgment, to recognize patterns in my family dynamics, and to build resilience. It became clear that this was not just about me or my parents, it was about a complex web of love, expectations, and human flaws. I also sought out friends who knew me well, sharing parts of my story in fragments. Their empathy was a balm, reminding me that I wasn't alone. They offered perspectives that challenged my fears and encouraged me to hold on to hope. One evening, after a particularly raw therapy session, I sat quietly in my apartment, feeling the weight of everything yet also a strange sense of calm. The turmoil hadn't disappeared, but I was learning to live with it, to carry it without being crushed. I realized that the exclusion from the will was not just a punishment, it was a mirror reflecting deeper issues in our family. It forced me to confront uncomfortable realities but also opened a door for growth. I understood that this was a moment of reckoning, a crossroads where I could choose to be broken or to rebuild. I didn't have all the answers, and I wasn't sure what the future held. But I knew I couldn't stay stuck in blame or despair. I needed to find my own voice, to understand my own worth beyond their judgment. Late at night, I allowed myself to cry, not just for the pain of rejection but for the loss of the family I thought I had. I mourned the version of myself that had believed in unconditional love. But I also felt a flicker of something new, strength, determination, a quiet hope. I told myself that this was just one chapter, not the whole story. That healing might be slow and messy but was possible. That I could choose to face the pain with courage rather than retreat into silence. And so I began to prepare, not for a battle, but for a conversation. Not for blame, but for understanding. I didn't yet know how it would unfold, but I knew I had to try. Because if love was going to survive this, it would have to be honest, vulnerable, and real. And that would mean facing the pain, not running from it. In that quiet space, I found a fragile resolve, to seek the truth, to listen, to forgive, and to rebuild. Not just for my parents, but for myself. The day I finally sat down with my parents to talk, the air was thick with tension. We met at the kitchen table, the same spot where countless family meals had been shared, but the atmosphere was different, heavier, charged with unspoken emotions. I could see the flicker of guilt in their eyes, but also a resolute seriousness, as if they had rehearsed this moment countless times in their minds. My mother's hands were folded tightly in her lap, her lips pressed into a thin line. My father avoided eye contact, staring down at the worn table, tracing invisible patterns. I felt a mix of anger, hurt, and an unexpected flicker of hope. Maybe, finally, we could bridge the gap that had grown between us. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm inside me. I need to understand, I began, voice trembling. Why did you really decide to write me out of the will? What is it that I did, what you think I did, that led to this? My mother looked up, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. It wasn't an easy decision, she said softly. We wanted to find a way to teach you something important, about responsibility, about respect, about the consequences of choices. It felt like you were drifting away from the values we tried to instill. My father finally raised his gaze, meeting mine. We saw you making decisions that seemed reckless to us. It felt like you didn't appreciate the foundations we built, the sacrifices we made. We wanted you to understand that life isn't handed to you, you have to earn it. Their words hit me hard, stirring a mix of frustration and sadness. I never wanted to disrespect you or the family, I replied. But I needed to find my own way, to live my own life. I thought you supported that. My mother's voice wavered. We do support you, but sometimes support feels like enabling. We feared you were taking the safety net for granted, that you weren't learning to stand on your own. I shook my head, the pain pressing heavy on my chest. But cutting me out, was that the only way? Did you ever think that it could push me further away instead of bringing me closer? They exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of the complexity between us. My father sighed deeply. We hoped it would be a wake-up call. A way to show you that actions have consequences, that respect is earned and maintained. I swallowed the lump in my throat, feeling the weight of years of misunderstandings pressing down. I'd been trying to make you proud, even if it didn't always look the way you wanted. But this feels like rejection, not a lesson. My mother reached across the table, her fingers brushing mine briefly. It's not rejection. It's tough love. We're afraid of losing you, to mistakes that could hurt you more than anything we could say. Her words softened the edge of my anger, but didn't erase the hurt. I want to believe that, I whispered. But it's hard to see it that way when the consequence is so final. My father nodded slowly. We're not perfect. Maybe we handled this the wrong way. But we did it out of love, a love that's scared and flawed. The vulnerability in his voice surprised me. It was the first time I'd seen that side of them in this conflict, the fear, the regret. It made me realize that beneath the anger and disappointment, we were all just people trying to protect what mattered most. I'm scared too, I admitted. Scared that this will change everything between us forever. My mother's eyes filled with tears, and she gave a small, sad smile. We don't want that. We want to find a way back to each other, but we also want to be honest about our fears. I felt a fragile thread of connection stretch between us, a reminder that despite the pain, the love was still there, tangled and imperfect but real. We talked for hours, peeling back layers of frustration and misunderstanding. My parents shared their worries about my future, their need to see me succeed on my own terms. I shared my feelings of being misunderstood, of wanting their approval without losing myself. It wasn't easy. There were moments when voices rose, tears fell, and silence hung heavy. But beneath the conflict was a yearning, to be seen, to be heard, to heal. At one point, my father said quietly, "Maybe we should have talked to you more openly before making such a drastic decision." I nodded, feeling the truth in that. Yes. I wish we had. I needed to hear your concerns, not just the consequences. My mother squeezed my hand gently. "We're sorry for the pain this caused you. We thought we were doing what was best, but we're learning too." That moment of apology, a simple but profound acknowledgement, felt like a crack in the wall between us. It didn't erase the hurt, but it opened a door. We agreed to keep the conversation going, to be more open and honest with each other, even when it was uncomfortable. To listen without judgment, to try to understand before reacting. As I left their house that evening, the weight on my chest felt lighter, though the journey ahead was still uncertain. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope that we could rebuild what had been broken, not just the will or the inheritance, but the trust and love that bound us as a family. Driving away, I looked back at their house, the porch light casting a warm glow in the dusk. The same house, the same family, but something had shifted, fragility replaced by possibility. I knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks and hard days ahead. But that conversation was a beginning, a step toward healing the wounds that had kept us apart. Sometimes, the hardest talks are the ones that hold the most promise. And in that moment, I was ready to walk through the discomfort, to face the fears, and to try, with everything I had, to mend the ties that mattered most. The moment I stepped out of my parents' house that evening, I felt something shift inside me, a strange mix of exhaustion and clarity settling over my thoughts. The conversation had been raw, painful, and yet, beneath the surface of hurt and frustration, there was a flicker of understanding I hadn't dared hope for before. But more than that, I realized something crucial: this exclusion from the will wasn't just punishment or rejection. It was a harsh, imperfect lesson, one they hoped would teach me values they feared I was neglecting. Driving home, I replayed their words, their hesitations, their sincere regret. They wanted me to learn about responsibility, about earning my place, about respecting the foundations they'd built. It was a lesson wrapped in tough love, and while the delivery was flawed, their intentions weren't malicious. That realization softened some of the sharp edges of my anger. But it also hit me hard: this wasn't about a permanent cutoff. It was a challenge, a test, maybe even a plea. A way to say, "We love you, but we can't keep protecting you from the consequences of your choices." And while that stung, I knew it was a message I needed to hear, even if it came wrapped in pain. I felt my emotions swirl: grief for the distance that had grown between us, frustration at the years of misunderstandings, and a cautious hope that this was a turning point. A chance not just to mend what was broken, but to grow in ways we all desperately needed. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the person I wanted to be, the person my parents had hoped I'd become. Not just their version, but my own. Someone responsible, respectful, but also true to myself. Someone who could stand on their own 2 feet without losing the family that mattered. It wasn't lost on me that this lesson was as much about them as it was about me. They, too, were grappling with fears and hopes, trying to protect a bond they cherished but didn't quite know how to hold. Their decision was flawed, but it came from a place of love twisted by worry. In the days that followed, I found myself reflecting more deeply on my own behavior. I asked tough questions. Had I been dismissive of their concerns? Had I taken their support for granted? Was my independence sometimes a shield for stubbornness or fear of vulnerability? I began to see the ways I might have fallen short, not just in their eyes, but in my own. I recognized moments when I'd pushed them away instead of inviting them in, when I'd chosen pride over connection. It was uncomfortable to face, but necessary. At the same time, I knew that growth wasn't about erasing who I was or blindly conforming. It was about finding balance, honoring my values while respecting theirs, building bridges instead of walls. I started small, reaching out more often with updates about my life, asking their advice even when I wasn't sure I'd take it. I listened harder during our conversations, trying to hear not just the words but the fears beneath them. I shared my own fears and hopes, letting down walls I hadn't realized were so high. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, frustration, and silence. But there was also progress, a slow weaving together of understanding and respect. I also sought ways to take responsibility in my own life, managing my finances more carefully, setting goals that aligned with my values and theirs, and being more mindful of how my actions affected those around me. It wasn't about proving them right or wrong, but about growing into the kind of person I wanted to be. In quiet moments, I journaled about these changes, the struggles, the victories, the doubts. Writing became a mirror and a compass, helping me navigate the complex emotions and keep sight of the path forward. One afternoon, I met with a close friend who listened without judgment as I shared the story. She said something that stuck with me: sometimes, the hardest lessons are the ones we don't want to learn, but they shape us the most. Maybe this is your turning point. Her words echoed in my mind. Maybe this was exactly that, a painful but necessary crossroads where I could choose to grow rather than retreat. I realized that the breaking point, the moment when I felt erased and excluded, was also the moment I could redefine my relationship with my parents and with myself. It was the moment I could stop seeing their actions as rejection and start seeing them as a call to change. That didn't mean I had to accept everything blindly or ignore the pain. It meant acknowledging the hurt, forgiving where I could, and being honest about what I needed moving forward. It also meant setting boundaries, not walls, but clear lines that respected both their concerns and my autonomy. Acknowledging that love could be tough but still compassionate. In the weeks that followed, I found myself more patient, more open, and surprisingly more hopeful. The lesson embedded in their decision was unfolding, not as a punishment, but as an invitation to maturity, empathy, and deeper connection. I knew the road ahead would still be rocky. There would be setbacks, misunderstandings, and moments when old wounds reopened. But I also knew I was no longer walking it alone or blinded by anger. I was beginning to see that family isn't about perfection or always getting along. It's about showing up, being willing to grow, and choosing love, even when it's hard. That evening, as I prepared dinner in my small apartment, I felt a quiet peace settle over me. The lesson my parents wanted me to learn was no longer a source of pain alone. It was a catalyst, a chance to become someone stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to embrace that challenge. Not because they demanded it, but because I wanted to heal, to grow, and to reclaim my place in the family, not as a shadow of their expectations, but as my own person, worthy of love and respect. This wasn't the end of our story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where lessons were learned, mistakes faced, and love redefined. And while the path wasn't clear, I was no longer afraid to walk it. The days that followed felt like stepping into a fog, uncertain, cautious, but filled with a quiet determination. After that pivotal conversation with my parents, I realized I couldn't just wait for things to fix themselves. I had to look inward, to examine not only the fractures in our relationship but the ways I had contributed to them. It was a humbling process, one that demanded honesty I wasn't always prepared for. I began by reflecting on my own actions and choices, the patterns I'd fallen into, often unconsciously. I saw how my independence, which I'd always prized, sometimes morphed into stubbornness. How my refusal to ask for help was less about strength and more about fear of vulnerability. How my pride sometimes blocked the very connection I craved. It was uncomfortable to admit these things, but necessary. I knew that if I wanted to rebuild trust, I had to be willing to grow, not just to meet my parents halfway, but to become a better version of myself. I started small. I reached out more often, sending texts or calling just to check in, even when I wasn't sure what to say. I listened more carefully during our conversations, trying to hear not just the words but the feelings underneath. I pushed myself to be more open about my struggles and fears, rather than hiding behind a facade of control. At the same time, I set boundaries to protect my own sense of self. I realized that growth wasn't about losing myself in the process of pleasing others. It was about finding balance, honoring my parents' concerns while also honoring my own needs and values. Some days were harder than others. I stumbled into old habits, defensiveness, withdrawal, frustration. But each time, I reminded myself why I was trying: to heal, to connect, and to reclaim a relationship that mattered deeply. I also sought outside support, recognizing that I couldn't navigate this alone. I continued therapy sessions, where I explored the layers of family dynamics and my own emotional responses. I learned tools for communication, empathy, and self-awareness that helped me navigate the rocky terrain. Friends became anchors as well. I shared my journey with a few close confidants who listened without judgment, offering perspective and encouragement. Their presence reminded me that growth is rarely linear and that setbacks are part of the process. One afternoon, I decided to revisit some of the old family traditions that had become strained over time. I invited my parents to dinner at my place, not for a big event, just a simple meal. I wanted to create space for connection without pressure or expectation. The evening was tentative. Conversations started and stopped, words hanging in the air like fragile threads. But slowly, laughter returned to the room, and with it, a sense of familiarity and warmth. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. I noticed my parents seemed more relaxed, less guarded. I felt my own defenses soften as I allowed myself to be fully present, not just as their child, but as an adult seeking mutual respect and understanding. In those moments, I glimpsed the possibility of a new kind of family bond, one built not on obligation or expectation, but on genuine connection and acceptance. I also took time to reflect on what I wanted moving forward, not just in relation to my parents, but for myself. I realized that self-growth wasn't just about fixing broken ties, it was about becoming whole on my own terms. I set personal goals that aligned with my values, pursuing work that felt meaningful, nurturing friendships that uplifted me, and cultivating habits that supported my well-being. I embraced the idea that responsibility included caring for myself as much as meeting others' expectations. At times, I felt the weight of the past lingering, old wounds that refused to fully heal. But I learned to hold those pains gently, without letting them define me. I accepted that some scars would remain, but that didn't mean I couldn't move forward. As weeks turned into months, I noticed subtle shifts, not just in my relationship with my parents, but in how I saw myself. I felt more grounded, more empowered to set boundaries and communicate honestly. I discovered a resilience I hadn't fully acknowledged before. One evening, sitting by the window with my journal, I wrote, "I am learning that growth is messy and slow, but it is also a gift. I am not the person I was, nor am I the person I will be. I am becoming." That becoming was both daunting and exhilarating. It meant embracing uncertainty, facing discomfort, and sometimes standing alone. But it also meant opening my heart to forgiveness, to love, and to the possibility of reconciliation. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be moments when old tensions resurfaced, when misunderstandings threatened to pull us apart again. But I felt ready to face those challenges with compassion and courage. Most importantly, I realized that growth was not a destination but a journey, one I was committed to walking with patience and grace. In quiet moments, I found peace in the progress, however small. I celebrated the steps forward and forgave the stumbles. I reminded myself that healing is not about perfection but about showing up, again and again, with an open heart. And so, I continued to nurture this fragile new chapter, one where family, love, and self-respect could coexist. Where lessons were learned not just through exclusion, but through connection. Where I could honor my parents' hopes while also honoring who I am becoming. It was a delicate dance, but one I was willing to learn. Because in the end, the greatest growth comes from the willingness to face ourselves and each other with honesty, humility, and love. The day of the meeting at the lawyer's office arrived with a strange mix of apprehension and resolve swirling in my chest. I wasn't sure what to expect, whether this would be another battleground or a step toward healing. My parents and I had spoken more openly in the weeks prior, but the formality of the setting added a weight that made my stomach twist. We sat in the small conference room, the sterile walls closing in, the polished table between us feeling like both a barrier and a bridge. The lawyer shuffled papers methodically, occasionally glancing up at us, sensing the tension that hung thick in the air. My parents' faces were somber, lines of worry and regret etched deeper than I'd ever seen before. Their eyes held a conflicted blend of resolve and sorrow, as if they were carrying the burden of their decision more heavily than I had imagined. It was clear this wasn't a matter they took lightly. The lawyer began by summarizing the changes to the will, stating the legal facts with clinical detachment. My name was omitted, replaced by provisions that favored others or charities. The words felt like cold echoes, but the real weight came from the silence that followed each statement. I looked at my parents, searching for something, an explanation, a sign, a flicker of doubt. Their eyes met mine briefly, and in that moment, I saw the ache beneath their stoicism. They were not villains in this story, but flawed human beings grappling with fears and hopes, trying to protect what they loved in the only way they knew. Finally, my mother spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "We wanted you to understand the seriousness of responsibility. This isn't forever. It's a lesson. We hope it helps you grow." My father nodded, adding, "We don't want to lose you, but we needed to make a statement, for you and for us." I swallowed hard, the mixture of hurt and empathy tightening my throat. I understand the reasons, but it still feels like a heavy price to pay. I want to grow, to be better, but I also want to feel like I'm still part of this family. There was a pause, and then my mother reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she covered mine. "We're sorry if this has hurt you more than we intended. We're learning too." The lawyer closed the folder and looked at us with a knowing expression. "These decisions are never easy. But it's clear there's love beneath the conflict." We spent the rest of the meeting discussing possibilities for revisiting the will in the future, contingent on changes and renewed trust. It wasn't a resolution, but a tentative step, a door left ajar. As we left the office, the weight of the moment settled over me. The legal documents couldn't capture the complexity of our emotions, the years of history, or the fragile hope that lingered. In the car, my parents and I sat in quiet reflection. The silence spoke volumes, of regret, of love, of the imperfect ways we try to hold on to each other. That day, I realized that the will was more than a legal document, it was a symbol of trust, responsibility, and the complicated dance of family ties. It was a mirror reflecting our fears and hopes, our failures and desires. And while the path forward remained uncertain, I felt a flicker of something vital, the possibility of rebuilding, not just the will, but the bonds that truly matter. It wasn't an easy decision, to forgive. The days following the meeting at the lawyer's office felt heavy with unresolved emotions. I wrestled with anger, hurt, and a deep sense of betrayal. Being written out of the will wasn't just about money, it felt like a severing of ties, a statement that I was somehow less worthy in the eyes of my own parents. The pain cut deep, and I wasn't sure if forgiveness was even possible. But as the weeks passed, I found myself reflecting not just on their actions, but on the nature of love, family, and what I wanted moving forward. Carrying resentment was exhausting, a weight that dragged me down and obscured the possibility of healing. I realized that holding on to anger was only pushing us further apart. I thought about the conversations we'd had, their fears, their hopes, their flawed but genuine attempts to teach me something important. I considered my own shortcomings, the ways I had pushed back, the walls I had built. Forgiveness, I slowly understood, wasn't about excusing their mistakes or erasing the hurt. It was about choosing to release the hold that pain had on me, to open a door for reconciliation. One quiet evening, I sat alone with a cup of tea, letting the silence settle around me. I thought about the years of memories, the laughter and the tears, the small moments of kindness that still lingered beneath the surface of conflict. I realized that beneath the fractures, there was still love, a complicated, messy, but real love. I wrote a letter to my parents, not to confront or accuse, but to express my willingness to forgive and to rebuild. I told them that I recognized their intentions, even when the execution was painful. I acknowledged my own mistakes and my desire to grow alongside them. I asked for openness, honesty, and patience as we navigated this new chapter. Sending that letter felt like stepping off a cliff, vulnerable and uncertain. But it also felt like reclaiming my power, choosing healing over bitterness. In the days that followed, our conversations became more frequent and more honest. The walls of silence and suspicion began to crumble, replaced by tentative steps toward understanding. We talked about our fears, our regrets, and our hopes for the future. We acknowledged the pain without letting it define us. There were moments when old wounds resurfaced, when frustration flared, and when forgiveness felt fragile. But each time, we returned to the commitment to try, to listen, to respect, to be patient. I also began to forgive myself, for the mistakes I had made, for the times I had been stubborn or closed off. I realized that forgiveness was as much about self-compassion as it was about mending family ties. Through this process, I felt a slow but profound shift, a lifting of the heaviness that had weighed on my heart. Forgiveness didn't erase the past, but it transformed it, turning pain into a bridge rather than a barrier. I noticed changes in my parents as well. They seemed more willing to listen, more aware of their own imperfections. Their eyes held a softness that hadn't been there before, a willingness to admit faults and to make amends. One afternoon, during a visit, my mother said quietly, "We're sorry for the hurt we caused. We're learning too." Her words, simple and sincere, felt like a balm. I reached out and took her hand, feeling the fragile but growing connection between us. Forgiveness wasn't a one-time event but an ongoing choice, a daily commitment to look beyond the pain and to embrace the possibility of love. It was also a recognition that family is complicated, that love isn't always easy, and that healing requires courage from all sides. I realized that choosing to forgive didn't mean I had to forget or accept everything blindly. It meant setting boundaries, being honest about my needs, and holding space for growth and change. It meant releasing the grip of bitterness that threatened to consume me and choosing instead to nurture hope. As I walked this path, I found strength I hadn't known I possessed, the strength to let go, to open my heart, and to believe in the possibility of reconciliation. I knew the road ahead would still have challenges, but I felt ready to face them with an open heart and steady resolve. Forgiveness had not erased the scars, but it had softened their edges, allowing room for new memories, new trust, and new love to grow. And in that space, I began to rebuild, not just the relationship with my parents, but my own sense of peace and wholeness. Choosing to forgive was not easy, but it was the best gift I could give, to myself and to the family I still cherished, imperfect and complicated as we were. I've learned that moving forward after something like this isn't about grand gestures or dramatic reconciliations. It's about the small, quiet shifts that slowly reshape how you see yourself, your family, and your place in the world. It's about waking up each day with a little more clarity, a little more strength, and a little more compassion, for them, for myself, and for the tangled mess of love that binds us. Since choosing forgiveness, my perspective on family has transformed. I no longer expect perfection or unconditional agreement. Instead, I see our relationships as living, breathing things, complex, sometimes fragile, always evolving. I've come to understand that responsibility is not just about financial or practical matters but about emotional accountability, showing up, listening, and honoring boundaries. Setting boundaries has been one of the most empowering lessons. For years, I thought loving my family meant accepting whatever came my way, no matter how painful. But I've realized that true love requires respect for one another's limits. It means saying no when necessary, protecting my well-being, and communicating honestly about what I can and cannot accept. This new outlook has helped me build healthier relationships, not just with my parents, but with siblings, friends, and even myself. I'm learning to recognize when old patterns resurface and to respond with awareness rather than reaction. I'm practicing patience with others and with the slow pace of healing. I've also embraced the idea that self-worth isn't tied to external validation, even from those closest to me. The exclusion from the will once made me question my value, but now I see that my worth is inherent. It's not something to be earned or lost based on others' approval. This realization has been liberating, allowing me to approach family dynamics with more confidence and less fear. At the same time, I become more mindful of my own role in nurturing connection. I reach out more openly, share my feelings more honestly, and invite dialogue even when it's uncomfortable. I've learned that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's the bridge that fosters understanding. There have been challenges, of course. Old wounds sometimes flare up, and not every conversation leads to resolution. But I've come to accept that imperfect communication is part of being human. What matters is the willingness to keep trying, to listen, and to forgive. I've also discovered that family isn't defined solely by blood or legal ties but by the quality of care and commitment we offer each other. This broader view has allowed me to find support and belonging in unexpected places, friends who have become chosen family, mentors who offer guidance, and communities where I feel seen. Professionally and personally, these shifts have rippled outward. I approach my work with greater empathy and resilience, and I engage with the world more authentically. The lessons from my family journey have become a lens through which I understand relationships, boundaries, and self-care. Sometimes, I still catch myself slipping into old patterns, seeking approval, fearing rejection, but I'm quicker now to recognize these moments and course-correct. Growth is not linear, and I'm learning to be gentle with myself along the way. Looking back, I see that the painful experience of being written out of the will was a catalyst, not just for family healing but for profound personal transformation. It forced me to confront uncomfortable truths, to set boundaries, and to rediscover my own voice. Most importantly, it taught me that love is not about control or conditional acceptance. It's about respect, vulnerability, and the courage to keep showing up even when the path is uncertain. I now carry a quieter confidence, a sense that no matter what happens, I can navigate the complexities of family and self with grace. I'm no longer defined by the past or others' expectations but by my own values and choices. This journey has been messy, painful, and beautiful. It has reminded me that we are all works in progress, capable of change and connection even after deep wounds. If there's one thing I want others to know, it's that setting boundaries and choosing yourself is not selfish, it's necessary. It's how we protect our dignity and create space for healthier relationships. And while family dynamics can be complicated and imperfect, they can also be a source of resilience and love when we approach them with honesty and compassion. I don't know exactly what the future holds for my family or me, but I'm no longer afraid of uncertainty. I'm ready to keep learning, forgiving, and growing. Because at the end of the day, that's what it means to be human, to stumble, to heal, and to keep moving forward with an open heart. I never imagined I'd find myself standing here, sharing this story, not because it's an easy one, but because it's a necessary one. The kind of story that feels tangled and raw, full of hurt and hope, mistakes, and moments of grace. I want to tell it because maybe somewhere, someone else is sitting in that same heavy silence, feeling lost and unseen, wondering if there's a way forward. Being written out of my parents' will was more than just a legal action, it was a seismic shift in how I saw myself and my family. At first, it felt like a rejection so profound it threatened to erase me. But over time, I learned that it was also a complicated lesson wrapped in love, fear, and hope, one that challenged me to grow, to set boundaries, and to redefine what family means. I want to share what I've learned, not to paint my parents as villains or myself as a martyr, but to embrace the messy, imperfect truth of family. Sometimes, love isn't gentle. Sometimes, it's a tough mirror reflecting our flaws and fears. But that doesn't mean it's not real. The hardest part was accepting that love and respect sometimes come with conditions we don't want to face. That tough love can feel like a punishment but might also be an invitation to change. And that forgiveness, both for others and for ourselves, is not a simple act but a journey filled with setbacks and breakthroughs. I discovered that setting boundaries is not selfish. It's essential. It's how we protect our dignity and create space for healthier, more honest relationships. Boundaries don't push people away, they teach them how to love us better. I also learned that growth is not linear. we will falter, stumble, and fall back into old patterns. But every step forward counts. Every effort to understand and to listen is a brick in the foundation of healing. Sharing this story is my way of saying, you are not alone. If you find yourself in a place where family feels fractured, where love seems conditional, where silence is louder than words, know that there is hope. Healing is possible, but it requires courage, patience, and sometimes the willingness to walk away in order to come back whole. I'm still learning to navigate this complex landscape. I don't have all the answers, and I don't expect perfection from myself or anyone else. But I've found strength in choosing myself, in forgiving, and in holding on to the possibility that family can be redefined and restored. If you're reading this and feeling the sting of exclusion, the ache of unmet expectations, or the weight of unspoken pain, please remember, your worth is not determined by others' approval. Your story is still unfolding, and you have the power to write the next chapter. Sometimes, choosing yourself means saying no to toxic patterns, setting firm boundaries, and walking away from what doesn't serve you. Other times, it means opening your heart to forgiveness and reconciliation on your terms. Both are acts of love, love for yourself and love for the imperfect people in your life. I hope my story encourages you to face the difficult truths, to seek honest conversations, and to embrace the messy, beautiful process of healing. Because family is complicated, but it's also where we learn to love, to forgive, and to grow. And sometimes, the greatest act of love is choosing to keep trying, even when it's hard. Thank you for listening. I hope you find your path to peace, to connection, and to the freedom that comes from setting boundaries and choosing yourself. If you loved the story, like the video and subscribe.